As a sort of preface to the larger conversation or to the direct textual conversation, I wanted to start just by talking a little bit about some of the origins and to focus in most of my presentation on some of the terms in specific that Weil uses in this book or in this note. But before getting into that, I just wanted to address really briefly something that I find really interesting about this text and the way that it's been received in English and the way that I read it as a result of that. So in the original French, it has a different title. And I think that that title is an important one to note because it very much changes the way in which we would read this text, right? So in the original French, the title is the note, and I'll translate it to English now, but it's the note on the general suppression of political parties rather than on the abolition of all political parties. And this is relevant for a lot of reasons. One, suppression and abolition are totally different things from a political science or political theory point of view, also from just a political process point of view. Right? I'm not a translator, but that said, the adjustment from suppression to abolition implies not only a difference in who the agent of this act, be it suppression or abolition, is, but also what that specific act entails. When we talk about suppression and think about that within the context of politics, we're generally thinking about a legal process in which an organization or an idea, right, is prevented not from existing at all, but from getting into the mainstream, from having significant influence, from participating or from being allowed to participate in a broader public debate. Right? Suppression is a legal process. It requires legal means. It requires a fundamental rejection, for example, of the idea of free speech as a holistic good in the sort of absolutist sense that we often take it to mean when we talk about free speech in the Anglo-North American world. And additionally, it requires legal format, right? Formal legalism in that sense. Lawyers, judges, police, these are the people who are involved in suppression. Abolition, on the other hand, has a very different connotation in politics and political theory. When we talk about abolition, we are talking about doing away with something, removing it completely, in some sense, from society. And especially in our contemporary moment, the most common form of abolition that we talk about is prison abolition in political science and political theory. And so when prison abolitionists and police abolitionists say that they want to abolish these institutions, they are not suggesting a legal process in which talking about prison is no longer allowed, in which suggesting imprisonment would be banned from polite society, things like that. What people are talking about in the sense of abolition in that case is the actual erasure from existence of these institutions through revolutionary social means. What's interesting about this note is that in the text itself, it very much bounces back between these two sort of contradictory frameworks for what to do about political parties. And I think that a lot of that has to do with who Weil's audience is, right? And I think it also has a lot to do with what the other things, what the other texts that she's writing in 1943 are, where she's writing them in London, right, while working with the Free French, and how to sort of read all of these in a certain way within the context that they were written for. Right? So one of the questions then becomes, why is it that they would title something initially the Note on the General Suppression of Political Parties when the English title on the abolition of all political parties may be more accurate in terms of what she's actually arguing in the text. Right? And one of those answers is that she's writing this for a conservative government in waiting, a government that's unlikely to take her advice at all. I think personally, from a scholarly perspective, I think that this is really important, and this is something that, for example, in my book manuscript, I deal with when I'm thinking about not just this, but all this piece, but also the need for roots, also what is sacred in every human being, and her other writings for 1943. I think the context of who the audience is and how Weil is trying to address these various audiences is really important. So I'll highlight those as we go through in various different moments throughout the reading today. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about some of the important terminology in this. I've already started kind of talking a little bit about the difference between suppression and abolition, but one of the most, I think, probably the most important term in this short piece is the word totalitarianism. As Weil scholars, we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about the difference between and the conflict between the collective and the individual, between these different frameworks. But this is one of these places, and Weil begins to use this term far more frequently, beginning around 1941 and 1942. Especially, it comes to, I think, it becomes an important frame within the context of her entire idea of politics around the time of her letter to a priest as well. And so totalitarianism, I think, is a term we need to define in order to understand this text. So first, the use of totalitarianism here, I think, is indicative of the influence of Boris Suvorin. Suvorin, as many of us know, is a very important, an important and influential mentor to Weil, especially when she's in her 20s and into her early 30s. They worked together in a group or on a journal, as well as at other times. They had a lot of mutual friends. At one point, Weil was invited to join the Democratic Communist Circle, which Suvorin was more or less the leader of. She refused because George Bataille was also a member, and she thought him despicable for many reasons, and how shall we say, the contradictions between their thought to be irredeemably too far apart, I suppose. So Suvorin, his influence in this, I think, is really important because he, along with other Russian emigres and Soviet emigres to France, began to use this term at certain points in order to try and tie together the horrors of Bolshevism, particularly the Stalinist brand of Bolshevism, alongside the rising fascist threat and the various different arguments being made for the totality of the state, the totality of the class, etc. Right? Raymond Aron is also very important in that. The word itself, however, has its origins in Italian. Right? And according to Simone Forti, an Italian philosopher, and her book, Totalitarianism, a borderline concept in political thought or in political philosophy, Forti argues that it's not actually the fascists themselves in the 19 teens who are the first ones to use this term. It's not Mussolini, it's not Gentile, it's not them, but rather the anti-fascists who began to use this term as a critical approach to talking about fascism, to talking about the dangers of the fascist threat. This is debated. this origins, right? Whether it comes to its earliest use in 1922's doctrine of fascism, or if it comes as a response to fascism. Either way, I think that the specific connection between totalitarianism and fascism as its origin point is a really important is a really important thing to keep track of in this text as well, because even though Weil is highly critical of the Bolsheviks, it is quite clear in other texts, I think, that if you truly gave her a choice of would you rather live under Soviet totalitarianism or fascist totalitarianism, I think she would probably choose the Soviet kind if that was the only option. The other thing I think about totalitarianism is that Arendt's definition, which has become the most popularized one from 1951 and the origins of totalitarianism, this one causes us problems in political theory and makes this idea very difficult to parse because Arendt is so determinedly anti-communist as well as anti-fascist, right? And because of that, as we see oftentimes now in political thought, this word has come to be a sort of liberal, it's used liberally and by liberal political thinkers to do that horseshoe theory thing, to make the argument effectively that left-wing ideas and right-wing ideas, if you follow them far enough around, become the same, which is totalitarian. Because of this, at some point a little bit later on, we'll take up the question of what is totality, which is different from totalitarianism. But at least to begin with, I wanted to start with this. Okay. Totalitarianism for Weil is the original sin of all political parties. Right? And one of my favorite lines from this note, from this letter, is the following, and it comes from page 4. She's writing here about the French Revolution, and she immediately makes a comparison and an analogy to the Soviet Revolution as well. Factional infighting during the terror, Weil writes, is best summed up by Tomsky's memorable saying, "One party in power and all the others in jail." Thus, in continental Europe, totalitarianism was the original sin of all political parties. This goes to her genealogy of the origin of the political party in the French Revolution. The Jacobins, particularly that debate club, as she points out, begins as precisely that, a form of salon, a space of open ideas, a space of debate, of disagreement, of political organization as well, but largely open to just about anyone or just about any idea, at least according to this essay. However, at a certain point, a doctrine begins to form. And when that doctrine, we'll come back to that idea in a moment, begins to form, the club, the debate club, that is the Jacobins, ceases to be a club for debate and becomes the first continental political party in the true sense. They take, in this sense, a sort of actualization of Rousseau's ideal of the general will, according to Weil. And Weil here takes up a particular problem with the general will from a critical approach. She says that for Rousseau, there is a problem in which he assumes that reason can be held collectively and that passions are individual drives. And this is sort of the fundamental basis of a larger critique that she's going to make and that she's already started to make in other places. We're all familiar with her writings collected in the volume Waiting for God, especially those in which she writes in her Hesitations Concerning Baptism about feeling as though if there were a group of young Nazis around her, all singing Nazi songs, some part of her would instantly become Nazi, right? This collective pressure and this collective passion, Weil argues, is something that not only is she personally somewhat predisposed to, as she writes in her Hesitations Concerning Baptism, but in this essay on the abolition of political parties, as well as in her letter to a priest, she says this is one of the most dangerous political phenomena that we currently face, right? In this moment of the Second World War, of the march of fascism, not just through Italy and Germany and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Serbia, and Croatia, but like around the entirety of the European continent. So why is this a problem in Rousseau's general will? Well, Rousseau argues that reason is identical in all men, and passions most often differ. He takes this in a certain approach, which leads Weil eventually to make, I think, an astounding claim, which sounds as if it is both in agreement and in disagreement with Rousseau, but also with Bataille, ironically, and the Marquis de Sade. Okay, so on page 8, there is a sentence in which Weil writes, "When a country is in the grip of collective passion, it becomes unanimous in crime." Why is this a critique of Rousseau, but in agreement with Bataille and Sade? Well, it's a critique of Rousseau because Rousseau argues that passions cannot be collective. Only reason can be collective because reason is identical in all men. I think, and I'll get into this a little bit more and where I think the roots of her argument about reason are in this essay in a few minutes. But to start with this question of passion. Right? Passions, on the other hand, for Weil, are those things which unite us. And I think that in some ways, this is very much a product of not just the political situation in which she's in and which she lives through in the 1930s and 40s, but also a general shift in an overall understanding of the process of reason, the practice of reason, and the interpretation of political passions as being either destabilizing or mobilizing, which really begins with Marx and critical theory, right? So Weil then is in line with other critical theorists of the early 20th century, whether they be more strictly Marxist than she is or not, which include people like Bataille, who is both strictly Marxist and also strictly Nietzschean, and more interested in the sort of positive possibilities of passion as well. Why do I say Bataille and Sade, though? Well, in his essay on the Popular Front in the Streets and his short doctrinal piece on the sacred conspiracy, the origins of the Acephal group, Bataille quotes Sade approvingly, arguing that this collective ideal of crime is in fact a revolution. Right? This is what is happening as far as Sade understands it, as he's yelling out the windows of the Bastille, encouraging the French revolutionaries in 1789. He thinks, he analyzes this as an encouragement towards collective crime, which he gives the name revolution. Bataille repeats this. He cites this unanimously in the same piece where he says, well, we should all form this, secretive conspiracy and overthrow everything. What's intriguing about this, I think, for Weil is that this shows, to a certain extent, some of the undercurrent of who not just her actual audience is in this piece, but who some of her potential perceived audiences could be for many of her writings in 1943. And that is other revolutionaries, other people who not just want to see a renewed France, but a renewed ideal of all of Europe, a renewed ideal of society coming out of the flames of the Second World War. So that leads us to this question again of original sin and how collective passions and totalitarianism come together. They point out three essential characteristics of the political party, and this is on page 11 for anyone following along, at least in this version, the English version. Right? Okay. These three essential characteristics are the following. First, a political party is a machine to generate collective passions. Second, a political party is an organization designed to exert collective pressure upon the minds of all its individual members. And third, the first objective and also the ultimate goal of any political party is its own growth without limit. Because of these three characteristics, every party is totalitarian, potentially, and by aspiration. Okay, so what does that mean? I think a little bit of digging into the annals of political theory is helpful here. First, a political party is a machine to generate collective passions. We've already talked about this a little bit, right? Her differentiation in this with Rousseau, her critique of Rousseau on the idea of collective reason or identical reason held by all men versus the possibility of collective passions versus individual passions. So a political party is a machine to generate these collective passions, to drive people, to drive its members, to drive its adherents into collective, unthinking participation in politics in some way. Two, it's an organization designed to exert collective pressure upon the minds of all its individual members. Political parties have doctrines. We'll take a look at what a doctrine is in a few moments, but political parties have doctrines. They have plans. They have programs. The Black Panther Party in the United States in the 1960s and 70s had a strategy for recruitment and a strategy for maintenance of its members. If you wanted to join the Black Panther Party, you could not simply go and join the party. You had to contact someone who was involved with the party. You had to meet them. You had to meet other members of the party in your locale. You then had to participate in a 6-week political education program, in which, among other things, you read Mao's Little Red Book, you read the Manifesto of the Communist Party, you read writings by members of the Black Panther Party, and then you had to take a test. And if you failed the test, you could not join the party. That doesn't mean there were no debates or differences within the party, right? But this is precisely, I think, what Weil means when she thinks about a political party as an organization designed to exert collective pressure. To be a member of a political party, you have to accept, or at least learn, for Weil, for these serious parties, and we'll get back to the serious and unserious ones in a moment, the general doctrine or program of the party. Whether or not it was rational, whether or not it came from deep, critical, intellectual engagement. Okay. So those are the mechanisms of the political party that are part of these three essential characteristics. The third one then is the objective and ultimate goal, growth without limit. This here, I think, is why her idea of totalitarianism is more skewed towards the critique of fascist politics than it is towards the critique of Soviet politics. Okay? Yes, on the one hand, the Soviet Union and its client states, eventually after the Second World War, sought to spread communism all over the world, sought to spread and hierarchically organize the international party in Europe and elsewhere. That said, its mechanism for doing so, other than conquest in the case of the Second World War, was to support and foment popular revolution in those places around the world, driven by the local parties and local activists. Fascism, on the other hand, functioned in a different way. Okay? And this is what I think is really important. One of the most important elements of Mussolini and Gentile's doctrine is that the party would replace the state, while simultaneously the state becomes the arbiter and definer of everything, including the people, the nation, the race, etc. The party becomes the defining characteristic of what is the state. Now, this is one of these fundamental elements both of Forti's and Arendt's definition of totalitarianism. And that a political party effectively sets up parallel institutions to the state and eventually combines those institutions in which the state becomes a mechanism, a machine for the party in a certain sense. Okay? So, the political party, the fascist political party, first it seeks to gain control of the state. Once it gains control of the state, it seeks total control of the state. Once it gains total control of the state, it seeks total control of society. Once it gains total control of a society, then it begins to try and exert its growth outside of the state through war, through violence. War, and specifically wars of conquest, are a particular aspect of totalitarianism, particularly fascist totalitarianism, that I think Weil has in mind here in 1943. She's living in England. She's looking at what's taking place, at what has taken place on the continent that she had to flee. And she sees that Germany is now not just Germany, but has conquered substantial portions of Middle and Eastern Europe, substantial portions of Northern and Western Europe, and is expanding its powers into Southern Europe as well. So this growth without limit is the mechanism by which the party takes each relative step for Weil from political parties seeking to gain some sort of domestic local power into political party driving global wars of conquest. This fundamentally violates, these three essential characteristics fundamentally violate what the party is in principle, which is, and quoting here, a party is an instrument to serve a certain conception of the public interest. This is true even for parties which represent the interest of one particular social group, for there is always a certain conception of the public interest, and these particular interests should coincide. If a party is totalitarian, that means that that party's conception of the social interest will eventually, if that party seizes power, gains power, is successful in moving its ultimate goal of its own growth without limit, then will make even those particular interests the public interest. I said I was going to go back into the history of political thought to make an argument for this, so here it is. This, I think, is Weil at her most Hobbesian. This is a woman who is very, very familiar with the Leviathan. And for me, it's especially in 1943, but even earlier in her 1934 writings, and even earlier than that in her 1932 essays, like Prospects and the Situation in Germany, there is a real undercurrent of the question of Hobbes's concept of sovereignty and how this actually, and both the differentiation between how it's supposed to function in a philosophical model and how it actually functions, which Hobbes makes direct. First, Hobbes argues that humans, because of our rational fear of violent death, that we, both as individuals and as collective groups, will seek, and this is a quote, power after power, ending only in death. In order to sustain ourselves, in order to achieve Hobbes's fundamental goal of self-preservation, he argues that the only way to do that is actually to potentially eliminate the possibility that others can preserve themselves, to band together and to be ready to do violence on others, power after power, perpetual expansion. So how does this work with this seemingly democratic conception of the social contract? Well, this, I think, is a really important element of how Weil understands politics as well, but I'll go back to Hobbes to make this argument. Hobbes argues in chapter 18 of Leviathan that because we all have this very rational fear of violent death that any other individual could bring upon us, even the weakest can kill the strongest, and all of these things, we really want to get out of the state of nature. And so we collectively and individually contract with a sovereign who we choose as the one power to keep all of us in awe, the one power that we'll all fear so we don't have to fear each other. Okay? We do this, Hobbes says, by contract. That's what he says in chapter 18. In chapter 22, which is the chapter where Hobbes differentiates between paternal and political despotism, he argues that sovereignty by contract is absurd. He says, yes, hypothetically, that's how it would work, but it never actually works that way. Why? For two reasons. One, we don't have time. Like, what happens between the moment, say, that Inez and Kate contract with the sovereign and I contract with the sovereign, right? If those things don't happen simultaneously, then they remain a threat to me and I remain a threat to them. The sovereign becomes a threat to all of us. The sovereign who's also going to seek power after power, which endeth only in death. Okay, so why is this absurd? Well, Hobbes says in chapter 22, he says, look, all of this idea of contract, it's very important, but also nobody's going to do that. Sovereignty by contract is absurd. There's one way to actually materially achieve sovereignty, and that's conquest. That's dominion and domination, which he differentiates from paternal domination, mostly because he wants to say, yes, like fathers can still have control over their families, but also the sovereign controls those families as well. Right? So, sovereignty by contract is absurd. Totalitarianism by democratic fiat is absurd. Parties, like states, appear, for Weil, she argues that they effectively appear, and to put this in Hobbes's terms, they appear as organizations brought together by a social contract, by mutual interest and mutual concern for the public interest, to compete for either permanent or temporary sovereignty in some way, shape, or form. In practice, they like all individuals and like all states in Hobbes's conception of sovereignty, seek power after power, which endeth only in death. There is no border limit for the growth of a political party, which coincides both with the international character of the Communist Party in the 1940s, but also the international character of the fascist alliances in the 1930s and 40s, and ongoing. All right. So why is it then that collective passion can't pierce this party machine? Right? And that's because parties for Weil have doctrines, much like religions. To step back before talking specifically about her critique of doctrine, I want to say one thing here. One of the things that I find most interesting about this essay, if we're going to call it an essay, is that it gives the space to think about religion and Weil's critique of religion through materialist political frameworks. In my book manuscript, for example, I argue that for Weil, the church, right, which is the sort of formal organization of religion, regardless of what type of religion it is, using it as sort of a catch-all ideal, is in fact the form of the political party. And Weil's critique of the Roman Church in particular, which comes a little bit here, mostly in The Need for Roots, is one in which we can see the way in which the church functions very much as a material, worldly political power. And that this is a really important thing for why, for example, she wouldn't take baptism, and why, for example, she never fully converts. She maintains her critique of various religious doctrines, etc. But it also fits into this concept of the party. Because the church functions in part, Weil argues, and this is in Letter to a Priest, through excommunication. Parties function in a similar way. Why? Because, as she argues, a doctrine cannot be a collective product. Now, historically, ironically, we know that, for example, Christian doctrine is a collective product, right? There's no singular author of Christian doctrine. There's no singular author of Hindu or Pythagorean doctrine. Something that Weil didn't know that we do know is like Pythagoras wasn't real. He was a guy made up by a group of women who were doing philosophy and needed a name to put to their collective arguments in philosophy and geometry. So sure, historically, she's incorrect about this idea of doctrine as a collective product, but to a certain extent, she's also correct in the context of the 1940s. Okay? Why? Because she's looking at these two types of totalitarian parties, both the aggressive fascist totalitarian parties and the more passive communist totalitarian parties. And she's seeing that in both cases, there's a hierarchical structure in which at a certain point, there is a singular person who is deciding what will and will not be part of the doctrine. In Germany, it's Hitler. In Italy, it's Gentile, but Mussolini pretends that it's him, that the decisions are his, right? He parrots Gentile's decisions. And in the Soviet Union, in the end, it's Stalin. Okay? And in the International Party, in the end, it's Stalin. So if a party is going to have a doctrine, then it's going to be eventually subsumed and subdued, suppressed even challenges to this doctrine will be suppressed by the final effective sovereign decider, in a certain sense, if I can quote George W. Bush. Someone is the decider, right? Bush famously, when asked if Dick Cheney was actually making decisions about the Iraq War in 2003, said, "I'm the decider," like a semi-petulant child. Okay, so doctrine. Political parties have doctrine. Doctrine cannot be collective, and therefore the collective qualities of political parties are top down rather than bottom up. Okay? All right. And oh, sorry, one last comment about this, and this is something that I do get into more in a bunch of the places that I've written about this. She they likens this to idolatry. And she doesn't use that term very much in this particular essay, where she uses it quite a bit more in other places. But just to read to you a quote that comes right after her argument that a doctrine cannot be a collective product, she writes, "The existence of the party is something concrete and obvious. It is perceived without any effort. Therefore, unavoidably, the party in fact becomes in fact its own end. This then amounts to idolatry, for God alone is legitimately his own end." And if we have time, oh my God, we're out of time. Oh. I didn't plan this very well in terms of time, apparently. Well, maybe we can talk about idolatry a little bit in the question and answer. I'm going to take 5 more minutes and just really quickly run through these other things. We're going to skip totality and go straight to propaganda. Okay. Okay. This, I think, is one of the most important aspects of this, because propaganda, while yes, the 1930s and 40s are sort of the ultimate age of propaganda when we think about them from a scholarly perspective, the sort of birth time of real mass propaganda in many ways. What I think is really important about Weil's critique of propaganda is that this is one of those spaces in which she actually reaches beyond these totalitarian parties in terms of her critique. Right? And her critique here is that propaganda, or the use of propaganda, is not to import light, but to persuade. Right? And by persuading people rather than teaching people, there is a hiding and a destruction of both truth and the pursuit of truth for individuals and as a society. And I think that this is really important because for Weil, and this fits back to this idea that God is his own end, for Weil, God, truth, beauty, and I argue a sort of a form of utopian social organization based in attention, these are the only ones that can actually be driven by these pursuits. And everything else, anything permanent and structured, institutionalized in a sense that they cannot be broken up, they cannot be challenged in certain ways, in which they can access the power of excommunication like a political party can. These get in the way of that. And propaganda is one of the ways that this sort of anti-teaching takes place, which results in the ability to not have to think. And this is actually where I'll stop and open things up for conversation. But I want to read one last quote, which I think is one of my favorites. And this comes from page 27. He's writing about these various different ways in which people frame their arguments, talk about what their political positions are, associate with political parties and political goals in certain ways. As a monarchist, as a socialist, I think that it is so comfortable. It amounts to having no thoughts at all. Nothing is more comfortable than not having to think. What I think is important here is that for Weil, I don't want to make the argument that she is engaging with a sort of agonistic conception of dissensus and politics in the way that later French thinkers like Rancière or the co-authors of Hegemony and Socialist Strategy think. Right? I don't think that's her framework. But I do think that her framework is one in which thinking has to precede the organization of politics and has to continue to take place during political organization. Therefore, right, claiming these particular political identities in this certain way means that we lock ourselves into a certain adherence, right? A certain submission of our thinking to the authority of any political party or political organization which puts those things into their name. And this means that we fail, both from a political perspective and from a philosophical perspective, to think about what the actual goals of these parties are, what the actual propaganda and politics of these parties are, and what the goals of the party as an institution, as a Hobbesian institution, are in this particular way. Okay, so that would be the last thing, but I'm going to read one last quote, and then I'm really done. She writes, the abolition of political parties would prove almost wholly beneficial. It would be a highly legitimate initiative in principle, and in practice could only have a good effect. What I think is interesting about this is that it's only almost wholly beneficial, and it's
Sorry,
highly.
Scott, can you read that again? Somehow I lost you for a second.
Yeah,
Can you just,
sure.
where
It's
was
on
that you
page
were reading?
28 in the English translation.
Okay,
So
thanks.
the abolition of political parties would prove almost wholly beneficial. It would be a highly legitimate initiative in principle, and in practice could only have a good effect. So it's only almost wholly beneficial and only highly legitimate. There's no totality in this claim. And yet, she's making a claim that in order to have some sort of good effect, to have a polity oriented towards truth, we have to abolish these organizations, these institutions which seek totalitarian control, which have no space for the almost, for the highly. There only needs to be total and full legitimacy. Thanks. Thanks for your time, everyone. You've now all experienced what it's like for me, for my students. It's like, oh my God, I'm out of time. Shit.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was wonderful. Such a rich reading. So we do still have lots of time, don't fear, to discuss and bring up questions. So I'll open the floor if anyone wants to. We can do the raise hand function. That's a nice way to kind of give a lineup. So and we'll just hop right in. John, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I find that Weil's work is divided at least into two parts. One are those writings of hers, which I'm totally on her wavelength. I believe that what she's saying is could be called almost be called divine truth. That included in that is her great essay on the Iliad, and those pieces of hers which I find problematical, but are valuable for stimulating thought and debate, which I believe this essay belongs to. I find myself both impressed and inspired and disconcerted by Leys' absolutism in this. And I think Simon Leys, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, the translator, put this in the context of her rejection, the rejection of her by the Free French, of her passionate desire to be part of the resistance, to be part of the Free French resistance, and that her ideas have been rejected. And I see this essay as a very emotional reaction to that. Mm. And she died very shortly after having written it. So I think it reflected this profound disappointment. And I think the extreme position she was taking is reaction to that. I agree to a lot of what she says, but she neglects certain things. She depicts passion as almost totally bad, and thought as almost totally good. But in my experience, thought without passion leads to very little that is good. I think that thought with passion is the only thing that leads to good permanent change. To give an example from our history, most Americans outside of the South knew for decades that Black people in that region, the former Confederacy, were being denied the right to vote, and they either vaguely or in detail understood that this was happening, but the general reaction was, what are you going to do? A shrug of the shoulders, and then suddenly people became passionately involved in that this was wrong, that this could not continue, and Black people organized and white people allied with that, and change happened. So I don't agree with her negative view of passion. It depends on the thought with which passion is allied. So this is a very pertinent essay for this particular time, because we're involved in what I consider not only an illegal and immoral war, but a very stupid one. And democracy seems to have failed us. So we have to inquire about the purpose of political parties and what kind of, what good are they? And I think abolishing political parties is like abolishing the tide, but to change the nature of political parties is possible. So we should examine what she's saying and how we can transform the party system. I would say what was said regarding top-down party dominance, regarding bottom-up party governance is something to be debated. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Scott, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that there's two things to consider in this regard. One, I don't necessarily want to take up the question of Weil's emotional response to the Free French in this regard, but I do think that these themes, especially the anti-totalitarian theme, the question of the highly organized political party or revolutionary party, and these themes go back to the 1930s with her. right? This is part of the reason why she critiques Marxism. It's one of her I think one of her most fundamentally anarchist positions, that is very much influenced by the anarchist tradition the French anarchist tradition she's very, very aware of, Proudhon and Fourier and what's his name? George Sorel as well, who was widely, widely read in Weil's lifetime. I also think that, there's a point that she makes in this essay, which is that democracy is not a good in and of itself, right? And I think that the question of democratic legitimacy for political parties, both in her time and our time, is fundamentally flawed. And this is part of the reason she's looking at this, right? She's well aware that, sure, did they ever glean a full majority in voting in elections? No, but like both Mussolini and Hitler were voted into power, right? And that is a particular problem for her, in regards both to the question of how parties function and party propaganda and this collective passion, versus the problem that she's having here. I also think that, well, I'll leave aside the debate about our different interpretations of the civil rights movement, but I would say that I would not agree with your history of the civil rights movement, that suddenly people were passionate about it. I would say that the movement began long before the 1950s, and only in the 1950s eventually gained enough intellectual and political participation rather than passionate participation to finally achieve a very small part of its stated goals. But I would disagree with the idea that it was a shift in passion in the 1950s that changed that.
If it's all right, we'll move on to, we got lots of questions, so we'll move on to Christina.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Scott, for this amazing presentation of the text. You touched so many arguments and ideas that are dear to me too, and you already answered part of the questions I had for you just with the earlier response. So I have just a couple of questions for you. So the first one is about, as you imagine, the conceptualization of totalitarianism. You were referring to Simone Forti's work, but it wasn't clear to me if you believe that we can accept that in Weil we can find already that sort of, at least germinal conceptualization of totalitarianism, and if you believe that's compatible with Arendt's one. I didn't really get that point, so that will be my first question. The second one, yeah, you already responded to that. The critique of democracy we find in Weil in regard also to this stance towards Rousseau, because here we find the social contract read through the lens of totalitarianism, right? Because there are no collective passions in Rousseau. But at the same time, and do you think this might be also not just a question of a critique towards democratic legitimacy, but also a critique towards representative democracy versus a more participative form of democracy for Weil? And I think about your remark that this is a text closely related to, let's say, the libertarian anarchic roots of our political thought. So that will be my second question. The third one is about Hobbes. Thank you very much for this, because this is the center of my analysis and reading of Weil too. So I have a quick question for you. Did you find any evidence besides the references to Thucydides of Weil's reading the Leviathan? And because I can clearly see these Hobbesian traces in it. I have also a chapter about it, so I'm so excited we're sharing this idea. But I also see a lot of Spinoza there, of this conatus essendi in this expansion, right? And then for me, there is this basic critique that Weil is in some way doing to the Leviathan, and it's the fact that the state now is the problem. It's not the nation state as the authority that can solve that sort of constant war of everybody against everybody. And the last one. This is clearly a test in which we can see that Weil is putting together politics and mysticism, theology, religion. So she uses a theological political paradigm to say it in some way. So how do you conceptualize the relationship between these two parts of her work that are so clearly, closely interconnected in this text? Pick what you want to answer, and thank you so much.
Okay. I'll start with the last part and go backwards. I think I read Weil's sort of alternation back and forth between the mystical and the political as being intertwined. I don't think that there's a need to read them as separate themes in her work. Maybe that's just like too political theorist-y of me to say, like, well, there's political theology in Weil, right? In a sort of similar way that there's political theology in Spinoza, even though they're both also critiquing that sort of tradition of political theology in the rigid sense. So that's often how I read it. I tend to draw connections between her. I use the concept of attention generally to draw that direct connection, and the way that she moves in her essays on attention from scholastic attention and mystical attention to the world, attention to the neighbor, which is to me straight out of Spinoza. Like it's in the introduction to the TTP where he says, like, we need neighbors. Neighbors are good. We should love them. And Weil sort of has the same approach to the neighbor there. I'll admit I haven't spent that much time thinking about where Weil references Hobbes. I really haven't spent that much time thinking about whether or not she references it, more as drawing.
I don't think she does. Yeah, that's why my question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would have to look back. I would think there's got to be something in the notebooks, and maybe some other places, but I haven't really looked specifically. To me, I think it's more like this would definitively have been part of her Platonist, Neoplatonist education, right? And so at some point, someone would have given her this, or she would have absorbed it perhaps through Rousseau and his critique of Hobbes in the Second Discourse, or something like that. Or as I draw a connection in some of my work between Hobbes and what Weil is critiquing in Hegel, particularly the relationship of the master and slave, in which, and once again, that's in that chapter on paternal versus despotical dominion, and the idea of the life and death struggle, which I think they very much both analyzes in, for example, her writings on the Iliad, but also rejects that as sort of like the fundamental source of politics, or at least of a good politics. Right? She recognizes it as the source of this totalitarian politics that she's criticizing, this war of all against all, this permanent expansion. But she critiques it as a potential source of what politics she desires. And in that sense, I do think, and I would go to the need for roots for my argument for this, her explanation of how she thinks the workshops and the Tour de France and the sort of picture of a free society that she imagines, this what I call a materially attentive society, in which there's lots and lots of direct democracy going on all the time. And so I do think that in the end, that's why, for example, in my book, I describe her politics as anti-fascist in the broad sense. So I don't have to like get into a debate of whether or not it's radical democracy or anarchism or Marxism, like, because there's direct democracy in all of those traditions. So yeah, I do know, at least in certain influences with that, she's certainly very influenced by Proudhon in that regard. And my conjecture, and it's just conjecture, is that I don't know if she did read, but she certainly had the ability to have read some of Pannekoek's works that were published in the mid-1930s. Her ability to read German was quite good, but I don't have any record of her actually reading those. Or Lukács, for that matter. She never mentions Lukács. But yeah. I think as a last comment on that, I think also the influence of Rosa Luxemburg's idea of spontaneity is really important here as well. And she does mention Luxemburg quite a bit, especially in the 30s. So I think that there's an element of that here as well.
Mercedes.
Yes, thank you very much, Scott. Hi, everyone. So I have a question, continuing with the quote that you give, Scott, from page 27, because I have no clear, I am confused with the concrete objective or scope of the text, because what do we want exactly to eliminate by getting rid of the political party, of a form of this form of organization, because it is not the form itself, but a specific phenomenon with that. And my question is concerning page 31, when Weil discusses what it will be like if political parties were abolished. And she said, naturally, clandestine parties might appear. It will not be honorable to join them. The members of these undergrounded parties will no longer be able to turn the enslavement of their minds into a public show. They will not be allowed to make any propaganda of their party. And in that quote, I have the feeling that apparently for Weil, like, the existence of these clandestine parties is not a problem, as long as, due to that secret nature, they cannot interfere with the patients and with the thoughts of individuals. So my question is Weil really against political parties or against that kind of empty political categories that you mentioned when I say, so I'm a conservative or I'm a socialist? In other words, like, she's against those words with capital letters that she says in the Power of Words, that we hide behind them so as not to think or seek the truth. Because if that's the main objective of Weil, the problem is not with political parties itself, but concerning what she said in page 29, that is the artificial crystallization into political parties that not coincided correctly with our ideas or with our process of thoughts. So I don't know what you think about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. I do think in many ways that this is a continuation of her argument about words with capital letters, right? And I think that she sees these parties and political parties, in particular totalitarian parties, right, as the sort of institutional formation of an institutional maintenance of those words with capital letters, right? So I think you're definitely on track with that. I do want to point out something the two quotes you just brought up are really interesting, right? Because on 29, she says the artificial crystallization, but then on 31, naturally, clandestine parties might appear, right? And so I think that for her, there is a goal in abolishing these to maintain a certain form of political openness, right? Her idea, to go back to 29 for a moment, right? The next paragraph after that, the artificial crystallization part is outside parliament, intellectual circles would naturally form around journals of political ideas. These circles should remain fluid. This fluidity is the hallmark of a circle based on natural affinities, distinguished a circle from a party and prevents it, et cetera, right? I think that there's something important for Weil about impermanence. And that once we take these words with capital letters, attach them to a political program, which they already stand in for in some sense, and give them a power base, which is rooted in propagandistic organization of collective passion for her, right? Then we begin to have this idea of like, well, what does this mean and how can we exclude certain people from it, exclude others from participation, et cetera, et cetera. And as these parties increasingly ossify, become increasingly like concrete and real power structures and institutional blocks, right? They begin to lose for her the original reason, the original intellectual idea that perhaps the founders were going for, right? And that's when we get this transition from a circle into a party, which then we're into this question of the problem of totalitarian aspiration. So I think that there's something really important about the anti-institutional aspect of this, for me at least. And once again, this is why I often think of Weil as like not necessarily belonging to one tradition of political thought, but in mixing different ones, right? Like this is a very anarchist idea in a sense. We shouldn't have institutional we don't need this institutional power. We need free flowing, constantly changing organization in which we're changing our minds and making decisions all the time. So that's my interpretation, right? Like in terms of the clandestine parties, I think that's just kind of funny. Like she recognizes like, look, we can abolish these, we can suppress them, we can jail people, but like they're not just going to go away, right? Like people are still going to try and do this. And I think it's funny that she says naturally, because so often I think of her as someone who's just like against the idea of human nature, against the idea of natural formation in these senses. And that's probably a little bit like my own, interpretation in that sense, because she does resort to arguments about nature more than I like to admit. But like, there's an aspect of that I think that she sort of sees as the sort of, I would call it maybe like in a Gramscian sense, like the organic composition, right? Based on the historical conditions. Like, sure, we've had parties before, like we'll have them again. And so I do think that to a certain extent, maybe this is a bit of a utopian argument in that sense. Right? Yeah. Thank you for those questions. Really great.
Teresa and then Gary.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to add a comment to what John has said, because from what I heard from Robert Chenavier and from the introduction to the French critical edition to the text, this idea of abolishing the political parties was not really something extreme in the Free French movement. Yes.
Yeah.
And
Sorry, go ahead, please.
is it because I had also another comment back on the difference between political doctrine and religious doctrine, which is still visible in this text, because what she calls Christian or Pythagorean doctrine is for her, in fact, not a body of some dogmas, but the truth that can be behind the dogmas. And the problem is only when these dogmas become something that members of a church are forced to believe.
Yeah,
That's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Teresa. I completely agree with you about the distinction between the religious doctrine and political doctrine here. And you know, I mean, my point earlier about sort of, you know, that we know that historically these doctrines have been put together by many people, right? That's a more of a historiographic point than a theoretical point, which you're absolutely right for Weil. This is a divine conceptualization which human beings have adopted and continued to think through. And that's why she argues that they're not collective products, right? And I totally agree with that. You know, I agree with Chenavier in the sense that this isn't all that radical a claim within the context of the Free French in terms of the abolition of political parties, but I also think that Weil is pushing against what she thinks is the sort of conservative version of that, right? And that this conservative version of it leads to, you know, a potentially non-democratic outcome, which she's concerned about. I think others were concerned about that as well. Her friend Maurice Schumann, for example, wrote about that later in his life, that there were debates around how democratic to have post-war France be. And he was sort of on the side of like, we need more democracy, not less democracy. And other members of the Gaullist camp were debating coming with other debates as well. So there certainly is participating in that conversation as well. Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Well, still, she thought that when it comes to religious dogmas, there's also always this element of human error, but.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And we didn't even get to the question of error and mendacity, which is just so important for this text and so rich for her thinking as a whole. Absolutely.
Gary. We can't hear you, Gary. You're not. It doesn't look like you're muted, but. Is anybody
like a cartoon character?
exactly, kind of chipmunk? Well, maybe as Gary figures it out, or if you want to maybe type out your question too, is another possibility, Gary. Does anyone have any other kind of follow-up questions? Or Cindy, yes, please.
I really appreciate your presentation, Scott. Really helped unpack a text that I wasn't all that I'd read, but I was quite fluent into. I recently
Cindy, you muted yourself.
Sorry, there we go. The notion of a party driven by will to power or power after power, capturing the mechanisms and the institutions of state to dominate both culture and society, and then move on to conquest. I guess all this is really relevant at the current time. And I think also, I mean, some of what you were saying, and as far as these terms of mutual interest and mutual concern, I just find these abstract nouns very actually dangerous. And why I say that is I recently read Laura K. Field's Furious Minds, the highly recommended, the making of the MAGA new right. And what it is it's really a history of, it's a good companionry to, like, say, the power worshipers and all the rest of those. But this is more very well researched look at the intellectual framework that's taken place over the last 50 years. And the terms are bandied about quite a bit as the common good. And so when we say mutual concern, and here these people are total will to power over their conceptualization of the common good, I just feel like that's very dangerous. And then they spend a lot of time talking about truth and beauty, and somehow they have the franchise on those concepts and what all that means. And so, and I also agree with when you were talking about the momentum in the civil rights movement, when it finally took off, that's because the intellectual groundwork caught up with the passion. So it's really a both and example. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. I totally agree about the danger of some of these terms. And I think that and this I think goes back to Mercedes' point about the sort of continuation of her argument in The Power of Words, right? And how this is sort of like the next step. If on one step we have these different words and these different terms that we kill and die for, but have no meaning, right? Because we capitalize them. So then the next step is like, well, who's capitalizing them and for what aim? And I think that that's very much what this essay is about in a lot of ways. And when I tried to write something a few years ago that brought these two essays into conversation with each other. This was like way back a few years ago. This was like a decade ago. It was 2016, actually, now that I think about it. And I presented it at like an academic conference. And then like at the end, it just never came together. Right? Like I had this idea and I had this thing that was like 2/3 written, and then other stuff had to be done and whatever. But I did actually go back and read that again to think about it. And now it reads somewhat hilariously because I started with the argument about the political parties, the Anglo-American political parties being unserious. And it's 2016. And so part of my claim was like, well, now they're serious, like, or at least one of them is, right? And I do fundamentally think that like in the US, we now have one serious party and one very unserious party, at least, which does not participate in these kinds of things. But because of that, they have no hope of actually being taken seriously by anyone. And I basically criticized Hillary Clinton for being nothing but like someone holding a bag of cash, right? In that moment, as well as Trump. But yeah, I think I'm going to have to go back to that that thing that was partially written based on your comments and Mercedes' comments as well, and see if I can rethink it again. Thank you.
Gary, let's give it a try again and see how it goes.
Thank you. Is my voice coming through? Okay.
Ooh, yes,
Sometimes.
you're in.
Okay. Yes, I had a comment and a question. My comment was about your slide on original sin. I really like that slide, the 3 points. But I would add another one to it, and that is that these are all control systems that funnel you into adversarial positions. So it's a part of the party system divides people up, just like the church is used to divide people up, and we're seeing it more and more in the United States, how Trump uses dividing up people in order to maintain power and to infiltrate, and it's leading to fascism on the top. So we don't rebel to the top, we rebel side to side. And then my question is, what can we do about it? But it started with what I decided to do about it, which was withdraw from I'm registered as a Democrat, and I thought, well, I'll withdraw. If people withdraw from the party system, because I think Republicans and Democrats are both disappointed in their party's performance in the last, I don't know how many years. But by withdrawing and becoming and voting as an independent, that would help. But I found out that there are 16 states that don't allow you to vote in the primaries if you are registered as an independent. So it's kind of like the control is not only federal, but it's a state, it's state by state too, that has kind of a control system that's funneling them into Democratic or Republican. You have to choose if you want to participate in the primaries. So at this point, in our current state, it feels almost academic, because what we're facing right now, what I think is with my friends and I think we may not have an election. It may be, martial law is declared by November, and that we don't get to have a vote at all. So we're very close to fascism, and it feels like, it's a dangerous time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. Yeah, I mean, I think that in the US context, right, the sort of institutional backing of these two political parties is very much one that has been that limits our options for political participation. And I think that, Wei's approach to this question does both and does really come into the question of like whether or not political parties sort of facilitate or limit participation, like actual content-based participation based on truth and thought, and even if they are antagonistic or contradictory conceptions of the common good. And I think Cindy's very right about that we use these terms far too loosely. I think that there's a certain element of her aiming for a greater participation here, when in that debate that was happening within the Free French, there were people who wanted minimal participation, right? There were participants in that discussion who wanted de Gaulle to be president for life, and that would just be it, right? And eventually de Gaulle was not one of those people, fortunately, because who knows what would have happened in that regard, right? In terms of the question of fascism, as Kate knows, at least, I don't know to what extent any of the rest of you are as terminally online as I am and Kate used to be. But I've been asking the question of, is it fascism yet, for a really long time. What some people think is an unfairly long time. But I mean, I think that there's a definitive goal and a definitive purpose in U.S. institutions, especially to minimize participation. I think that there are certain tacts being taken. I can see in Canadian institutions doing similar things, starting with floating some of these things in Alberta, at least to start with, and Ontario a little bit less so. There's the fascist international, as I would call them, is very powerful right now, in lots and lots of places, and that comes back to the question of this power after power, and the seeking to expand without limit and such. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly an element of that involved here, and I think the last thing I'd love to say about this, is that, and this goes to what you just said, Gary, as well. Um, and Mercedes brought this up, that quote from page 27. Right before that, they writes about why people might join a political party, right? And her argument is that that one would perceive in the actions and propaganda of the party like an agreement between oneself and the party program. Um, but that very quickly turns into subsuming all one's thinking to the party, right? And I think that in the US, we are definitely seeing that. I think, ironically, I think that that's happening in a particular wing of the Democratic Party. That is more of a problem than it is even in the Republican side. But I do think that is a reality of part of what has happened in the US. And I think that the plurality of parties in European polities and European institutional frameworks make exit from failing parties more possible, like what we've seen in the recent local British elections and things like that, where the Greens have now become the actual party of the youth and of the left, leaving Labour to basically collapse in some of these elections. So, yeah, yeah, that's my thought.
Well, and we are past time, so thank you all for sticking through, and thank you again. Please join me in thanking Scott for such a wonderful talk, wonderful discussion.